Hello methodology students, and welcome to M14, which is Teaching Speaking 1. So please open up your notebooks, and you want to write down the number and the name of today's class, as well as the question of the day, which is how should we sequence speaking activities in a lesson? So the value of today's lesson is that you're going to see certain criteria proposed by Penny Ur, which help us to determine if our practice activities are giving the students what they need to practice grammar appropriately. And since we're talking about teaching speaking, let's just think back on what you already know before we start. So you've learned about how to activate schema about a topic and how to establish context to interest students in either a reading or a listening text, and how to process that reading or listening text using top-down and bottom-up processing. Now, what typically follows that is zooming in on particular target grammar and asking questions to elicit the meaning and the form and the use of that grammar so that students can kind of notice and understand grammar before the next thing, which is output, restricted or controlled practice of that grammar, either with speaking or with writing. So moving into output, and that's where we are today. So some of you will have already done M13, which is teaching grammar, and some of you will do that after this lesson. And so just keep in mind they've already been presented with grammar, and now we're kind of practicing it through speaking. So as we jump into our objectives, a couple of the things that you're going to be aware of today. You should be able to define communicative competence, what that means in this context. Basically a balance of fluency and accuracy, right? And you should be able to classify some speaking activities according to whether it's focused on accuracy, which would be more restricted, or more of a fluency focus. And to do this as a video lesson, I've given you some task slides, which look something like this. So when we come to these slides in the presentation, you can pause the video and edit your slide. There's only 3 things. The first one is going to ask you to define in your own words these criteria. The second one is going to just ask you to match these example activities to the task types, which are listed in your book for today's reading, task types 1 through 8. And the last one is simply a ranking task where you're going to put the practice activities which we talk about in a given order, 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever you come up with, from the most restricted to the least restricted or most authentic practice. All right. And so, what's the sequence of components in a lesson? I spoke a bit about this at the top of the lesson. What happens during input? What happens when students are learning? What happens in output? You might be picturing the image of the head, where you have input coming in through your ears or your eyes in the form of listening or reading, and you have sort of learning tasks which guide students to notice certain things, to make connections, right? To sort of determine meaning for themselves. And you have output activities, which we're talking about today, where we're asking them to speak, we're asking them to use language. Sometimes we ask them to write, We'll cover 2 classes of teaching writing a bit later in this unit. Many ways to plan lessons. So just think to yourself, which of these is the kind of lesson style that you are following when you write your lesson plans? Is it lesson style 1, which is traditional PPP, where you present language, in other words, you present grammar, and then students practice it with restricted practice, and then they have some fluency practice? Or is it lesson style 2, where it's an enhanced PPP? We start with activating schema, and we move into input, of course, establishing context for that input, top-down, bottom-up processing, and from that input, we focus on grammar, which is we guide students to discover that grammar, and then we move into restricted and authentic output. Or is it lesson style 3, where we start with reading, then go directly into grammar or lexis, and then we practice, and then we focus on another language focus, which could be lexis, and then we practice? Or is it this task-based lesson style 4, where we activate schema, and we go right into fluency, and then we practice grammar kind of more accurately, and then we do some kind of discovery of grammar, and then we practice again? So 1, 2, 3, or 4, say your answer to yourself right now. And if you said 2, you would be correct. This is the lesson style that we focus on. Today, of course, we're on this practice square, specifically practicing restricted output by speaking. So remember these things, remember these 3 components of input, learning, and use. We generally want to follow this pattern. Today we're focusing a lot on use. Which brings us to the first activity for you in your task slides. Now, before I ask you to pause and go into your task slides to write your own definitions of each of these criteria in your own words, I'm going to kind of talk to you a bit about what they are in my own words. So when we talk about Ur's criteria, what do you need to remember? Basically, that they help us to create good grammar practice activities. That's the value of Ur's criteria. That's the importance of them. And then later, for example, when you write your PSLP, which will be a productive skills lesson plan, and you are writing a rationale for your restricted practice activities, you could say, oh, I think this meets the following of Ur's criteria because whatever your reason is, right? So let's go through them, and I think the order that I have them in here is basically from the easiest to understand for students to the more difficult to understand for students. So the very first one is interest, which you probably understand already, even if you haven't done the reading for the homework. So interest is basically saying that a good practice activity is going to be something that's interesting for students, not boring, right? So the topic is interesting, the content is interesting. One of the easiest ways to make a practice activity interesting is to personalize, right? Make it more meaningful for them. Okay, use their names, for example, in the practice tasks. Use something familiar to them, right? And our next criterion, which is, by the way, the singular of criteria, our next criterion is quantity. Quantity, and if you know the English word, this one should be easy too. That just means that students are getting enough practice. So if you say this is a great practice activity for my students and they have to answer 2 questions, that might not meet the threshold of Ur's quantity criterion. You want to make sure they get enough practice, and I'll tell you why. because it has something to do with the purpose of this stage. When you're in restricted practice, your goal is to use the language a lot and get it right. Right? So quantity, you should have lots of chances to practice. Next, we have this idea of validity. Now, if you do the reading, it gets kind of complex and difficult to understand in the way it's described. Now, for our purposes, validity criterion is very simple. Okay, what that means is, are students really practicing what you think they're practicing? Right? So, for example, if you think that your practice is present perfect practice, and so you say, have you been to Europe? Have you eaten sushi? Have you been doing this for a long time? Well, that last question is no longer present perfect. Now you have present perfect continuous. Have you been doing? Right? So you want to make sure that the practice activity itself is sticking to the target grammar and not something else. This is often a problem when we have, sometimes teachers, maybe they don't put enough thought into their practice activity, so they just kind of come up with a bunch of questions and they're not really looking closely at what the students are going to say as a result of those questions. So be really careful about validity. Okay. Now our next one is not really a difficult concept, but you might not have seen it expressed this way. Success orientation. Success orientation simply means that we care that our students get it right. You want it to be easy enough that they're getting it right, not too easy, but you want it to be appropriate for that level, right? Think O+1, right, from our SLA class about Swain. So you want to get them to the point where they're getting that new grammar right. It's not totally easy like something they already know, but it's a little bit higher, and they're getting it right because you want them to get it right. You want them to succeed. Now, we used to say that, if they're not, we need to do error correction here, which is true. We need to do error correction here because we want them to get it right. We used to say, do error correction or the students are going to memorize the wrong form. In other words, they're going to fossilize that inaccurate form. But now we know more about the way the brain works. Fossilization isn't as big a concern as we used to think. But in any case, we want students to get it right in this stage because they're practicing. Okay, and finally, this is certainly the most difficult one for TESOL students to understand, and that is heterogeneity. Okay, heterogeneity simply means we want students of different levels to have a chance to produce something at this stage. So you're going to have a class of students, and they're going to be at slightly different ability levels, and so you want them to be able to produce something at their level. Now you might be thinking, well, there's a lot of fill in the blanks, and it seems to be written there's only one possible answer. Well, Ur would say if there's only one possible answer for 5 different things, that's not very heterogeneous. Like if there's only one answer that's acceptable, it's not really very heterogeneous because there's not much room for variation of the kinds of answers you will get. So let me tell you an easy way to make a task heterogeneous. You might have open-ended questions, right? If you have an open question, then, for example, how did you hurt yourself, right? That's an open question. Now, the high-level student, he can say, well, it was It was a rainy day in March. The grass was slick from the moisture. I was running at a good pace because I felt that it would be my last opportunity to run before the weather changed. Suddenly I slipped, fell, hurt myself severely. Ambulances arrived. They took me to a hospital hastily. They worked on me for hours. And this is why you see me before you with this cast on my leg. Right? Very high-level answer. Open-ended question. High-level student can answer at their level. Low-level student, how did you hurt yourself? I fell down. Okay? So they can answer kind of at their level. That would be a heterogeneous task. Okay, so if you ever wonder how can I make my practice task heterogeneous, throw in an open-ended how or why, for example. All right. So another way you can remember these and remember the purpose of these criteria is a little sentence that I came up with that I think helps students a lot. Here is Orr's criteria in one sentence. Okay, so students of different levels need lots of interesting and appropriate practice getting target language right. If you remember this sentence, you will master Orr's criteria. So you're going to have students of different levels, so you need a heterogeneous task. You need lots of practice, that's quantity. It's got to be interesting and appropriate, like the right kind of practice. You're practicing the right target form, okay? So it's always present perfect, or it's always present continuous, whatever you think you're practicing. And you want them to get it right. So not too difficult. Success orientation. Keep in mind that success orientation also means you're going to be doing error correction in this stage, because we're talking about restricted practice. All right, so error correction can happen while students are doing the activity, or you can take notes as they're doing the activity, and at the end kind of guide them to notice some of the things that they said that were inaccurate, get them to self-correct, for example. Swain's metalinguistic function from SLA. All right. Now this brings us to your very first task in your individual task slides. So what you want to do is jump over to those slides and write in your own words, what each of these criteria means. Okay, so try not to write exactly what you read, and try not to write exactly what I said. Just kind of whatever's going to help you to understand. Okay, so go ahead and do that in your task slides. You can hit pause right now on this video. And we're back. Okay, so you have done that. You have gone into your task slides and done the first task, which brings us to your next task. Now your next task is going to be related to pages 82 to 84. It starts at kind of the bottom of 82. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this very well. The bottom of 82 we have type 1 task is about awareness. Type 2 is a controlled drill. And on the next page we have type 3 controlled responses through sentence completion, rewritings, or translation. Type 4 meaningful drills. Type 5 guided meaningful practice. Type 6 structure-based free sentence composition. Oh, there's more. And at the top of page 84, we have type 7, structure-based discourse composition, and type 8, free discourse. Okay, and so what I've done is I've taken each of those and I've made an example, and your task is going to be, in your slides, simply match these activities to these task types. Is it task type 1, type 2, type 3? You can just put the number next to the activity. You can put just 6, 7, 8, whatever, right next to the activity. Okay? And these task types, by the way, are important for us to know because it's important for you to know what you're asking students to do when you ask them to practice language, right? And this is also showing you that there's more than one way to practice language. It's not always fill in the blank. It's not always something as simple as that. Keep in mind, too, that you're kind of pushing a lot of output here, and so that's always useful to get them to give creative, personalized answers, for example. All right, so go ahead and push pause and jump over to your task slides to complete this one. And we're back. Thank you for completing those 2 tasks. And now there are many ways to plan lessons. As we know, we've talked about this a lot. We're focused on the enhanced PPP, which came from the traditional PPP. Traditional PPP, there's nothing wrong with it. It's a great way to go. And sometimes, if you don't have time in your lesson, it's good to just focus on grammar and then get students practicing it. So PPP is still useful. But notice something that is always, 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 whichever version of PPP you're using, we always go in this order. Okay? We always start with the accuracy-focused, restricted practice, and then move into fluency-focused, authentic practice. So the first thing we're doing is we are getting students to practice that grammar, getting them to get it right, you know, the success orientation, the validity, and then, all right, let's move into some fluency stuff. We're not so concerned with grammar anymore. Let's express ourselves, express function and the discoursal system in different ways, right? To accomplish some kind of communicative goal, which we'll talk about in Teaching Speaking 2. And the goal of many classes and textbooks is interpersonal communicative competence, like in ICC. Okay, we don't have to worry about the chat window task. You're off the hook for that, no problem. Now, everybody, write this down in your notebooks because this is a very important idea. Okay? Everybody repeat after me. I don't care if you're in a library or you're on the subway or you're at home with your parents, with your husbands, with your dogs and cats. Say it loud. Communicative competence is the ability, to exchange ideas and information with another person well. To exchange ideas and information with another person well. Very good. Nicely done. Okay. And now, methodology students, take that last word well, which you've written into your notebooks, and circle it. Circle that word well. Okay? When we talk about that, when we talk about doing something like this well, when we talk about, let's see, can I circle it? Let's circle. I'm going to circle. Let's do it. Yay! Okay? When we say you're exchanging ideas and information with another person well, what does that mean? Okay? What does it mean to exchange ideas and information with another person well? How is that related to what we're talking about today? Well, you could say maybe it has something to do with using that language accurately. So it has something to do with your pronunciation, using the right grammar, choosing the right words, right? And that all comes down to this major concept that we call accuracy, right? And so now I have got to erase this. It's annoying me. Okay. So part of that, when we're talking about exchanging ideas and information, well, part of that is your accuracy, right? So are you using the right words? Are you pronouncing it accurately? Are you using the right grammar for what you're trying to say? That's all coming down into accuracy. So what's the other side of that? Well, the other side of communicative competence is the opposite of accuracy, which is fluency. Okay, so what's fluency about? Okay, when we're talking about accuracy, that's going to be lexical, grammatical, phonological, as I said, the right word, the right grammar, the right pronunciation. When we're talking about fluency, we're talking about using those other systems, the functional system. How do we accomplish a communicative goal, right? For example, I want to buy a coffee in the coffee shop. So I need to use the function of making an order, right? Maybe you're apologizing, the function of apologizing, right? And the discoursal system is situational, right? It has a lot to do with everything from genre and formality to appropriateness, the person you're talking to, right? If you're talking to the president, you're going to speak one way. If you're talking to your best friend, you talk another way. If you're talking to your dog, well, I don't think you're going to use real formal language with your puppy dog, right? We'll talk about discourse a bit more in speaking to. And by the way, that was related to homework question number 5. Again, communicative competence requires that we balance accuracy and fluency. And a lot of people say hesitation is a sign of low fluency skills. However, I would always say excessive hesitation, not just hesitation. And the reason for that, of course, is it's natural to pause. You know who pauses a lot in their speeches? Barack Obama, right? And I don't think anyone would say he's not fluent in English, right? And I would also pose this question to you, methodology students: which of these is more important, right? Which of them is more important for proficiency, for your overall English level? It's an interesting question, right? Because the answer, of course, is they're both really important. Okay, and we're going to talk a lot more about that in teaching speaking too. Which brings us to our third activity in your task slides. This third activity is just asking you to evaluate and sequence some activities because, as I mentioned earlier, we always move from the more restricted to the more authentic. It's kind of the right direction to go. You know, really, really controlled and restricted to less controlled and more authentic. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to look at some different activities in your student book, and you can see them on pages 85 and 86. I'll also walk you through each of them so you know kind of what they're about. Okay? They're all present perfect activities. By the way, this is why we don't allow you to use present perfect in your own lesson plans, because all of our materials are based on the present perfect. So we like you to do a different target grammar when you come to that task, when you come to those lesson plans. All right, so let me take you through each of them in the book. If you notice, activity number one is life experience. You can see it here on this slide, the farthest to the left. So basically what's happening is students are walking around the classroom. Okay, these are all present perfect, right? So they're walking around the classroom and they're asking at least two people these questions using present perfect. So they would say, "Oh, Jihei, have you ever driven a car?" And Jihei says, "Yes, I have driven a car," or "No, I haven't driven a car." Okay, or "No, I've never driven a car." Okay, and then you write their name only if they have. I'm trying to find two people this is true for. They're going all the way around the classroom asking people, okay? By the way, in terms of quantity, two people, find two people that say yes to each. This would be a great, this definitely has Orr's criterion of quantity. That's a good thing about this one. But your goal is to say, okay, is this more or less restricted than the other ones? All right. By the way, if you struggle with this activity, think about this. How much of the language that's being used by the students is provided right here in the activity? Just think about that. Okay? If the language that they're going to use is almost entirely coming from the activity, in other words, they don't have freedom to use other language, other words, other grammar, then that would be what we call a very restricted activity, right? Think about that. Now, whereas if they have a lot more freedom to use different grammar forms, to use different vocabulary, to express themselves, personalize in different ways, then that would be a little more authentic, wouldn't it? Just think about it that way. All right, activity 2. Activity 2. I love activity 2, guys. I got to tell you. Activity 2, tell me more. Love it. Okay? It's the next one there. Activity 2, tell me more. So what you're going to do is you take one of your examples. You take, for example, break a bone. Okay, and similar to the first activity where you're asking people, have you ever broken a bone, right? Now, if the person says no, they have to ask you, okay, no, I haven't broken a bone. I've never broken a bone. Have you? And then they answer, yes, I have, or no, I haven't. Now, check it out. If they say, yes, I've broken a bone, well, then that triggers another question. When was that? When I was at school. What happened? Da-da-da-da-da. So basically you're saying, tell me more. And now the student's going to say a little bit more. Now the student's going to express a little bit more. That's tell me more. And I love it, love it, love it. Ask yourself this. You might pause the video for this. Ask yourself this. And tell me more, which of those criteria from Orr's criteria is really, really strong here? Like the first one, we can see right away quantity because there's you're going to ask a lot of people a lot of questions. The second one, there's another criterion that I see here. Pause, think to yourself, and then push pause again. And we're back. This one is very, very heterogeneous. Why? Because tell me more, the lower level student is going to say, I broke my bone, it hurt. The higher level student, again, say as much as they can. Right? So very heterogeneous with that open-ended question. All right, so you have activity 1, activity 2. What are they in relation to each other? Activity 3. Now we're turning the page. Activity 3, vacation money. Okay, we're looking at vacation money. Vacation money is a role play. There's a role play. Okay, so there's, as I recall, One person is a teenage kid, and the other two are parents. Teenager has to talk about, has to try to convince the parents to give them money to go on a trip. And then one of the parents is trying to convince the child, I've done enough for you already, right? And one of the parents is trying to help the child convince the other parent. Okay? So again, they can use present perfect to do this, but are they limited to present perfect? I mean, it's just saying, just convince the person. You can see a lot of freedom in this one, right? It's a role play. Just think about where that would be on your continuum from very restricted to very authentic. And the next one is a classic. Next one's a classic, 2 truths and 1 lie. Okay, 2 truths and 1 lie. What's happening here? Activity 4, 2 truths and 1 lie. So they're using present perfect, and they have to come up with 2 things that are true, 1 thing that's a lie about themselves, and then their partners, their classmates guess which one's the lie. Right? So, I've worked nights, I've seen an eclipse, I've lived overseas for 3 months. Which one's a lie? Partner says, you've never lived overseas. Okay, so here's another one where they're using only present perfect, but they can kind of make their own sentences. There's a little freedom there, right? Yes, they have to use present perfect, but their examples are their own. So think about that, all right? Which leads us to, that's it, those 4 activities, right? So you want to just rank them, and the way you rank them, you can either, let me just show you, in your task slides, you can either just like, sometimes students will draw a line, and that's my number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, or easy peasy lemon squeezy, just highlight the sequence that matches what you have. Remember, there's no wrong answers here. This is all for participation credit, right? Just like you would get in a normal class. Okay? There it is. That's exactly what your slide looks like in your individual task slides. I'll draw your attention to something else here. As I mentioned, Uhr's criteria are they're typically used with restricted practice activities to determine how good they are. So validity, quantity, success orientation, etc. When we get into fluency activities, we have a few different considerations. When you're just going for fluency, like the second activity, so first there's a restricted one and then there's a fluency authentic one. We have a few different things that you should consider when we're talking about fluency. This will help you if you think about it now. It'll help you in speaking too. So if you're trying to use a fluency activity, make sure there's a clear communicative purpose, if you can see that there. A communicative purpose is simply a reason to use language. Okay, so why are you talking about this? What's the function that you're practicing, right? What are you trying to accomplish by using the language? Like we saw that example of vacation money. Everybody had a function. You're convincing your parents to give you money. That's your communicative purpose. Or you're trying to persuade your husband to agree with the daughter. That's a communicative purpose. We can't just say, okay, talk. Just talk about this topic. That's not really a communicative purpose. Why are they talking? What's their communicative goal? Okay, so when we're talking about fluency activities, that's later. Think about communicative purpose. Also, that second one I want to draw your attention to. Is there a reason for everyone to talk? In other words, does everyone have to participate in order to successfully do the activity? Now, if your activity, your fluency activity I'm talking about now, if a fluency activity is designed such that one participant can just kind of sit there and hang out, then there's no what we call positive interdependence. Positive interdependence means you can't do it unless everyone is participating. You can't successfully do the activity unless everyone is participating. If you go back to that vacation money activity, the role play, if you have those three people, that the child is trying to convince the parents, one parent is trying to reject that and convince that they've done enough for that child. The other parent is trying to convince the parent to do what the child wants. Well, if the teenager in this one is just kind of not saying anything, then the role play doesn't work, right? They all have to be doing their part. So we would say that has a high positive interdependence. It's a very important thing with fluency activities, not to give away too much about where vacation money would be on this continuum, but just a tip. All right, and before I leave you, there's just a couple of things I wanted to share with you. As you know, in your digital resources folder and in your student book, there are a lot of links to digital resources for practicing different things. And these are some that I've compiled that are great for different kinds of speaking practice. So this one here, Voicethread, is like an online bulletin board. It's really cool. I've used it with my students. You can have them leave little video comments or text comments or audio messages on the pictures that you put there for them. I really like it. I really like it. It's Voicethread. Check it out if you have time. There's another one which is kind of fun. It's not really speaking, it's more like singing. SingSnap is an online norebang, and it was completely free. And I actually went to this online norebang and I checked it out. And yeah, that was me. That was me. I think I was singing Gangnam Style. Don't tell anybody. Haha. Okay, so those are some digital resources you could check out if you have a chance. And finally, that brings us to your homework. Speaking now to fall 2021 students at SMU TESOL, your next class is going to be M13 Teaching Grammar. So we kind of did a flip there. So this digital asynchronous video lesson would be more appropriate for video. This grammar lesson, I'd really like to have you in the classroom because it's super important. All right, and that's on page 74. So make sure you complete that before you come back to methodology class. And just a final reminder, as you're doing this task, hopefully you're doing it well before the due date, because you've also got to do this homework before our next methodology class. I'm giving you a lot of time, but the earlier you do this, the better. Okay, guys? Well, thank you for tuning in, and I will see you in the classroom. Bye-bye, everybody.